Good afternoon, everyone. It's about 2 o'clock Eastern and ready to get started with our latest IRIS webinar. This is your host, Danielle Sumi, speaking from the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology headquarters in Washington, D.C. IRIS is a consortium of universities and an NSF-funded science facility operating programs that enable Earth scientists to perform advanced research in geophysics, particularly in seismology. And webinars are recorded and archived on our IRIS YouTube channel, so you can always check that out or pass along to a friend if they're interested in the subject. To lay some ground rules, only the presenters, Tim and Deanna Sellnow, and I will speak. If you have a comment or question as the webinar unfolds, then please clearly and concisely type it into the box on the webinar control. At the end, I will read your name and question to the speakers. If similar questions have been asked, I may combine or skip them. If the webinar crashes, which has actually happened twice, I will simply reboot it. Just click the link you received by email when registering and everything should be fine. At the end of the webinar, I will be sending out a short 5-minute survey via email. And the survey is done via SurveyMonkey. Your opinions and insight will help us inform future webinars. One of the questions will ask if you're watching this remotely in groups, so if it's more than just you, please let me know. Today's webinar is part of IRIS' continued effort to provide resources and tools that enable research and professional development. In particular, many of us conduct geophysics research, but are not trained in really how to effectively communicate our research results to the public or even to our peers. In crisis situations like after a major earthquake, we may find ourselves at a loss of how to properly communicate to the public when many of the public are looking to us for direction and how to respond. Our presenters today are experts in this subject, Doctors Deanna and Tim Sellnow, who are professors in the Nicholson School of Communications at the University of Central Florida. And Tim and Deanna focus on strategic communication for management and mitigation in organizational and health settings, among many other research areas. Their research is often in conjunction with governmental organizations, but perhaps notably, especially for this group, with the U.S. Geological Survey. Also, Deanna and Tim have authored and co-authored many peer-reviewed publications and textbooks on risk and crisis communication. So I couldn't think of two better people who could really communicate with us on this subject. So without further ado, here's Tim and Deanna to talk about ideal model message design and distribution strategies for rapid response risk communication before, during, and after earthquakes. So take it away.
Thank you, Danielle. We're very pleased to have this opportunity to share our ideas with you and to go through some of the different practices and ideal strategies that we've come up with over the past 3 decades of research on risk and crisis communication. As Danielle said, we spend a lot of time working specifically with earthquakes, but to get to the model that we're going to share with you and the specific strategies that we'd like to share, we'll show some of the background work that we did as well.
So we always like to start with the answering our so what question. In other words, why is it that we do what we do? So our research stance and all of this research that we do for risk and crisis communication has 3 pillars. We're always message focused, we're always solution driven, and receiver oriented.
Before we go any further, I think you need to understand our research philosophy. We've both been tenured professors for many years. What keeps us motivated and what keeps us going is not grant dollars or books sold, but rather that we believe that we've come up with strategies that if we share them broadly can save lives. So that's our first and foremost objective, and everything we talk about today boils down to that one primary objective, saving lives.
The other thing is that our goals are always receiver empowerment. We care about the receiver. We're trying to figure out ways to get messages out to empower people to make informed decisions, because what we've discovered is people make decisions, but they're not necessarily the right decisions in crisis situations. And so we want to empower people to make informed decisions that will prevent negative behavior and encourage constructive responses to the event.
We're also very positive in our focus in that we understand that academics get a are criticized often for focusing on the problem. We deconstruct issues to the point where we don't really provide any kind of hope or optimism, but that's not how we look at it. We believe that by defining the problems and the challenges of risk communication, we're already halfway there to providing the kind of solutions that, as we said, can be receiver-oriented and save lives.
We also, before we begin, just want to acknowledge that we've had a lot of funding and collaborative support, and much of this research has been possible because of the collaboration efforts that we've had with various organizations. And not only just governmental organizations, but with various colleagues that study risk and crisis communication across the globe. So what we're going to talk to you today about is the IDEA model for effective risk and crisis message design. And the IDEA model, we'll talk a little bit about how we came to the model, grounded in what theory. Then we'll deconstruct each of the components of the model. And then we'll describe a couple of current campaigns that we're working on using the model for message design and testing, and then talk a little bit about our next steps. Okay, our IDEA model development, we realized that we wanted to ground it in instructional communication theory, because what we're trying to do is get those receivers to understand what's going on, to be motivated to attend to the message, and then to behave the way we'd like them to behave. And so we went back to John Dewey's experiential learning theory to begin trying to figure out how to construct these messages. We also knew that we had to think about learning outcome metrics, and we took to measure whether or not the learning is happening. And in instructional research, there are three areas of metrics that you can measure on. One is affect. How does the receiver perceive the relevance or the value or the utility of whatever the information is? Behavior. Performance, will they enact the behaviors that will help protect them and their loved ones? And cognition, do they comprehend or understand what's going on? It's really the ABCs of instructional communication measurement.
So we did a number of studies. We've done research, as I mentioned. We've been on this topic for many years, but the accumulation of research really involves all different types of research methods that are typical at the social science level. We did robust case studies to understand what are those strategies or best practices, content analysis to understand how people are using media, surveys to understand people's preference and to understand how they behaved in different disaster situations or crisis situations, focus groups to develop and test messages, and then the key is to do all that work to do message testing experiments where we actually develop and test messages to come up with the kind of recommendations that we'll make here at the end of our presentation.
And so what we came up with is we discovered, we first thought when we were looking at experiential learning theory that if we tailored the messages to the different learning style preferences, people would be better able to attend to, comprehend, and behave if it was tailored to their message. But what we found out is that all people, regardless of learning style preferences, need to have a way to come into contact with the material in a way that they are motivated to attend to it, understand it, and behave. So it took all areas, and that's where the IDEA model came into play. It was grounded in experiential theory, but it became even actually simpler than that. The components are internalization, distribution, explanation, and action. And what we've been doing now that we've developed the model is we keep using the model to design messages and test messages in various crisis types and situations and with various populations. So the components, just to give you an overview of what they are, internalization is there needs to be some answer to the question, am I or those I care about affected, and how? Distribution, which channel or channels will best reach the target populations for whatever risk or crisis event we're dealing with? Explanation, people do need to know what's happening and why it's happening. And action, they need to also have specific actionable instructions about what they should do, or in some cases should not do, for their safety and well-being. And what we discovered in our early content analyses is that most of the status quo messages that were coming out through television, radio, and traditional broadcast media privileged explanation over the other areas. In other words, more information about what is happening, why is it happening, what is happening, why is it happening, but at the expense of the other components in the IDEA model.
Here's a study that we did to back up what Deanna just mentioned. We recorded all the messages that were available on news programming, televised news programming. And keep in mind that many of those televised news programs were also then linked to Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Of the hundreds of messages that we collected and on which we performed a content analysis, we found that only a fraction of the messages told people during a major egg recall where people died and salmonella was spreading in the thousands of cases. Only 8% of those messages had specific actions that people ought to take, and only 2% of those talked about what people should do if they thought they were infected or potentially infected by salmonella. So this is a dramatic example, and there are many others. We'll show you a couple of more here. We also did a study for the United States Department of Agriculture that focused on the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. This was an unprecedented crisis that came out that demanded what we call an unprecedented communication response. 100,000 young pigs were dying every day, or were dying each week in the United States. Pork prices were going up. It was a situation where the only way that the disease could be stopped was to come up with some actionable solutions, communicate them, educate producers, and then share that research. So what we found is that the process of internalization is absolutely essential before we can get to the kind of actions that we can explain. For example, we had individuals saying, this could be you, to try to explain how other producers had suffered. If the barrier is provided without reason, personnel will find a way to get around it. In other words, without helping people understand the importance or the risk of what was going on in the spread of this disease, which, by the way, spread to 30 different states in a matter of a year, which, as I said, is unprecedented. So the whole issue that we're talking about here is that the lack of internalization and explanation in a sense that can be utilized prohibits the kind of actions we hope people will take. So we're hoping that as we go through this process, we'll talk about some tailored distribution strategies to provide succinct, quick, easy-to-read messages that include all aspects of the idea model and not just limiting to explanation where we're talking about how bad the problem is.
We also learned some lessons from some of our research about explanation. So we now know that action step without internalization, people won't care and they won't take the action. They'll try to do a workaround. Lessons learned about explanation. Also, explanation alone is not sufficient to achieve education, to achieve those measurable outcome metrics that we need. For example, some said that recommendations merely told them what to do without the element of education needed to encourage compliance. And communication shared in response to PED-V lacked a metric to measure whether or not workers learned from the crisis. So again, those metrics of affect, cognitive, behavioral to achieve learning need to be included. The other thing that we learned across multiple studies was with, I mentioned this just briefly before, with regard to learning styles and the learning cycle. Tailoring messages to key on receiver learning style preference was not significant. It didn't work. And regardless of preferred learning style, learning outcome achievement, which was measured by affect, behavior, and cognition, was significantly better when the message addressed those three components: internalization, explanation, and action. So now we would just like to unpack the elements a little bit about what can be included in the message so that you're making sure that you're addressing these three things: internalization, explanation, and action. Internalization has to do with compassion, relevance, proximity, timeliness, and also we discovered some work with exemplification that can get people to attend to the message. In terms of compassion, one of the things that we discovered is early on in our work, and this was probably 15, 20 years ago, most of the messages that were being told through broadcast media by scientists and experts tended to be very non-personal. In other words, there wasn't a sense of compassion. We like to use John Maxwell's quotation, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." And we made a pretty big argument that what needs to happen first is people have to know that your hearts and prayers go out to the victims, their families, and their loved ones before people are ready to listen to what they need to do and what's happening. Personal relevance. Visuals can be great for personal relevance. Is it affecting me? Is it in my geographic area? How bad is it? What can I expect to have happen? The proximity. They love to have a map. Even though GPSs, we did some work because smartphones nowadays have the GPS factor, so it seems like people wouldn't need to have a map, but people want to see a map of where the location is. And they care about proximity for themselves if they're in the area, but the way the world is now, their loved ones are all scattered across the globe, and so it's also, they can be at a distance if they know people that are in the area.
And that example with proximity focuses on some earthquake early warning messages, and we'll talk more about that later.
Mm-hmm. Timeliness, they need to know how much time they have before the symptoms are going to show. They need to know how much time before the shaking is going to occur in the case of an earthquake, when the hurricane is likely to hit land. And then exemplars. Exemplars are cognitive shortcuts. They're short, evocative words, phrases, visual images, or sounds that quickly get people to get to the crux of the argument. And what we found, if we put superfood up there, that's an example of a positive exemplar. If I say superfood, what comes to mind are things like blueberries, avocados, broccoli, kale, right? We immediately cut to a cognitive shortcut. But what we've discovered is that when it comes to risk and crisis events, very seldom do we see people using positive exemplars, but very often using negative exemplars. And this example up here on the screen is for biotech food, but it's, frankenfood, and so it's a quick way to think, oh, this is bad, GMO, bad, bad, bad. It's an example of a negative exemplar. There are some positive ones. Smokey the Bear is definitely, to put out forest fires, is an example for a crisis situation. We did some work to discover some of this exemplifications when the pink slime story came out in school lunches. Remember, pink slime is lean, finely textured beef. Lean, finely textured beef. That's no exemplar, is it? But pink slime is. And just to show you what can happen, the consequences of the negative exemplification taking hold in people's minds as a cognitive shortcut. At that time, major supermarkets stopped selling ground beef that included LFTB, lean, finely textured beef. Fast food restaurants stopped using it. The BPI company, which was the major producer of it, laid off 650 employees, so people lost their jobs. The consumer cost for lean beef skyrocketed, and the consumer cost for even low-quality beef skyrocketed. So there were a lot of consequences from this negative exemplification. And it was actually the equivalent of throwing away 5,700 full beef carcasses per day while that happened. Of course, later they discovered that the lean, finely textured beef was not a risk to consumers, and BPI was actually able to come back and resume production. But there was a time period of some serious consequences.
Another area that we've studied related to earthquakes is we've done some work with the triangle of life. Many of you have heard of that. We believe that that is a misleading exemplar. Sounds very positive and is relatively easy to enact, but there's really no research that suggests that the triangle of life is superior to stop, drop, and take cover.
Mm-hmm.
So hold on.
Hold on.
Yeah. So a couple things. We spend a lot of time looking at distribution because the landscape of media continues to change. One of the key focuses for message distribution is on convergence. And if you think about it, many of you, as you watch television and hear something on the news, will look at your phone, maybe look up, you'll find a fact that someone will mention. You'll wonder if that's true. You'll want to hear more about it. You'll use your iPad. You might look at your smartphone. But this kind of convergence where people get the same message from multiple credible sources in our research shows repeatedly to be very positive and very influential. So
what's really exciting about that is sometimes people will ask us, well, what about these myths or these hoaxes that get told over social media and that people might believe them? But what we've discovered, if that hoax or that myth doesn't get corroborated in multiple ways, it's an outlier. People are able to understand that.
Right, and there's hope for us because we can counter those. Well, we've got some research we'll talk about in a minute where we can counter those myths on the same mediums that people are using to spread them.
And we'll give you a few little conclusions here that we've drawn from some of this research about distribution. People actively seek information from multiple sources, and we are all living examples of that because when we watch television, we have our smartphones or our laptops or our iPads right there to double check and corroborate. We recognize convergence among the messages when the similar message is being told by different sources and through different channels. People are able to evaluate source credibility. If they see something on Twitter, they're going to go look. Typically, if it's about a risk or crisis situation, and let's say it involves earthquakes, they're going to go to the USGS to see if the USGS is saying that same thing. They do turn to social media for convergence. They do look for that multiple avenues of the similar message being told. And they constantly challenge convergence. In other words, even though there's a convergence, they're still always just checking to see if that's really still true.
And as I mentioned, we can use that to our advantage, and that's clearly what happened in this example. When Deanna talked about lean, finely textured beef and pink slime, ABC broke the story and first used in a broadcast the term pink slime. Perhaps people had used that term in the past, but most people never saw lean, finely textured beef before it was ground in with their beef. So this story became very powerful, created an exemplar, and individuals became concerned, and even to the point where, as Deanna talked about, all those different impacts. But what we found in an experiment where we identified a film produced and uploaded onto YouTube by the American Media Institute that countered everything that the ABC News program said, when we showed people this second video, they were able to resist that message or to refocus on what lean, finely textured beef was. So next slide will show, we had people look at the video first, the ABC News first, the video first, and a variety of different concoctions of order of the message, but it didn't matter. Each way that we showed the message, as long as they saw a counter message in this whole process, this distribution process, their fear of this product went down. So what does that say to us? It says that we have a fighting chance to compete with those myths and false stories that find their way onto the internet or even traditional media.
So we've talked about internalization, we've talked about distribution. The next component is explanation. Explanation is that what's going on and why. What we've discovered in our research is that source credibility is important, and source information, the science has to be accurate, but it also has to be translated in a way that the basic consumer receiver can understand it. And sometimes that's really a challenge for scientists, we've discovered, because the jargon of the field, to be so precise, it's hard to think about creating a message that is intelligible for general audiences. Source credibility can be the USGS, certainly it can be a broad scale level, it could be the Weather Channel, but source credibility also has to do with local opinion leaders. It's really important to get local opinion leaders to also spread the word of the accurate message. This is a picture of the Fargo floods, the first of the 3 500-year Fargo floods that happened in 1997. And this is the sandbagging that happened behind our house. We lived by the river at the time there. And this fellow is Dennis Wallaker, and he was the local emergency manager in Fargo at the time. And even though all the national broadcasters, meteorologists were there talking about when the flood was going to crest, what the local people wanted to hear is, what does Dennis Wallaker think? And he garnered so much credibility by the end of that flood being so accurate with what his forecasts were, that they actually had voted him in to be the mayor, and he was the mayor until he died. He died a couple of years ago. Similarly, this guy was just a local radio sportscast announcer that followed the NBSU Bison sports. But he decided he was willing to be on the radio 24/7 to keep the people informed about what was happening with the flood and what to do. And he actually ended up going on to have his own show on MSNBC for about 10 years. In terms of accurate information in science, yes, it has to be accurate, but the most important thing is that it has to be intelligibly translated. And I like to put this little probability for dummies book up here, not to be silly so much as to say it's okay to explain probability in lay terms, because probability is something that people have a hard time with, and numeracy as well. So if we can use words and we can explain it in a way that's simple, people are going to receive our message more accurately.
And many of you have had difficulty in trying to explain probability, to explain to people why they are at greater risk in the buildings that they develop, or that the insurance that they're asked to keep on a building because they're in an earthquake-prone area. Trying to explain that probability is complex, and it's frustrating for both the receiver and the sender.
Mm-hmm. Well, the consequences of not explaining accurately and intelligibly from reputable sources is that the receivers will either do nothing at all or they'll do precisely the wrong thing. And we did some work on the L'Aquila, Italy earthquake, and that provides a pretty stunning example. You might recall that that was a 6.3 magnitude earthquake, and 309 people died, 1,500 were injured, and 65,000 were temporarily displaced. But it was actually failed risk communication, lack of being intelligibly translated science of the scientists and the public officials prior to the earthquake that resulted in them being sentenced to 6 years in prison for manslaughter. Now, the 6 scientists did get out and acquitted, but the public official, I believe, is still there.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some pretty serious consequences of not intelligibly translating.
But when we do provide these translations and discussions, we have to be careful not to over-reassure. This is an example from some work that we did in collaboration with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention during the H1N1 pandemic. We tracked all the messages that we could find and that we were able to download into a system that we had back when we were in a laboratory that was had message tracking capacity. So if you can see in on the slides that I'm particularly interested in the green and the red lines. The green and the red lines show you that this is the discussion of the H1N1 virus. That's the red when we're talking about what's the virus, what do we do about it, who's got it at that time, and how is it spreading. The green line, which mirrors almost identically to the red line, is discussion of vaccine. Why did that become such a popular and actually integral part of the story? Because promises of developing a vaccine were made overly optimistic, were what I would say over-promised, and what happened is that over-reassurance resulted in what we call a shadow story that didn't stop until the whole process was resolved. And on the blue line is equally problematic in that a second line of discovery or a second line of coverage became focusing on the shortage itself and the fact that even when there was a vaccine, there was going to be a shortage. And so you can just see this all happened due to what I would call over-reassurance in the explanation process.
And so then the fourth and final component is action. And with action is about being very specific about what to do, when to do it, how to do it or not do it, in both preparation to an upcoming risk event that is being forecasted, and in response when the crisis acute event happens. All important. What we discovered in some of our earliest research on this aspect is that people thought that they were providing action steps, but they weren't specific. They would say, go to the website for more information, and that's not a specific action step. Drop, cover, hold on is a specific action step, and that's good. Here's an example of an action step that food safety folks said was their action step. As you can see, it's ambiguous. Okay, I'm supposed to get serious, but what does that mean? What am I supposed to do? When? How? Here's one that's a little bit more specific, but it's also a lot of information to absorb quickly. Chill, clean, separate, cook. Here's one that's simple, also uses an exemplar, fight back, the little back guy, right? And it's very, very simple to keep food safe from bacteria, fight back. So now what we'd like to do is just briefly address a couple of ongoing campaigns. One we'll briefly touch on a little bit with food safety recalls, but then we'll get into the earthquake alerts and warnings that we've been working with.
As I mentioned, we've done a lot of experimentation with our messages, with a pretest survey, and then we provide a message or a treatment, and then we provide some sort of a test after that fact to understand the kind of behavioral intentions we can generate with specific messages. That's what we're talking about for food safety. We can show, do you have time to show briefly part of this?
We could show just a little bit of it. What we did here is, this was a sample news broadcast. We've done a lot of these, and what we do is we find an actual news broadcast that happens in a food safety situation, and then we create a treatment one that includes all the elements of the idea model, and then observers get either the status quo message or the treatment message, and then we measure them on those three behavioral instructional learning outcomes, and to get an ecological validity, we always consult with the food scientists, with the media professionals to make sure it makes sense. For this would be a media story. This would hold up as valid.
A new outbreak of a potentially deadly food contamination involving ground beef is touching the entire state.
Well,
Food Safety and Inspection Service. Correspondent Ron Blom has details. The recall is based on an outbreak of foodborne illness that appears to be associated with ground beef. Meat sold in a number of regional chains and locally owned grocery stores throughout the state. Experts believe a rare form of salmonella is to blame for 27 confirmed illnesses and 1 death. Salmonella is a microscopic bacteria that can cause infection and is most commonly found in undercooked food, including beef. As to the source, 19 of those infected reported consuming ground beef purchased directly from Kentucky stores over the past month. The beef recall includes any size package of ground beef that have sell-by dates.
so that example is of the treatment message, and of course when we show the message to our subjects, they don't get to see the little triangle up in the upper right-hand corner that says what it is.
Because we've used this to train journalists. They've asked us about better communication of science, and we're able to do that. We've done it in several countries, including the United States, with the Association for the Education and Research in Journalism, AJMC. Done a lot of work with them as well to help understand how we can develop these messages that are more helpful, and to help reporters communicate science, but also to help people that are communicating with reporters to give them the information they need to follow this idea model.
So the hypotheses and research questions that we've been using to guide this food safety is that all elements of the learning cycle model will be perceived as more effective than the status quo. It'll have the more positive impact, and are there any relationships among sex, race, and message type? And what we've discovered is that the idea model across all these different times we've done message testing has been significantly higher in all of the affect, cognitive, and behavioral intentions than those viewing the treatment message. And there have been no interaction effects among sex, race, and message type for behavioral intentions. So we feel like we're really getting a lot of good empirical evidence to support this model.
So we have this research that gave us some good background, and we were able to move that forward into a very exciting project, a couple of projects with the United States Geological Survey.
Right, and so one of the things that we were asked to do was, can we address the idea model in seconds? We said 10 seconds or less, on a phone app effectively to help people protect themselves and save lives. And of course, I didn't want to overpromise, but I said, sure, we can do that. But we did. We had internalization, we had a map, we had intensity for relevance, a countdown. We used the app that they asked for, translated it, and the action was always drop, cover, hold on. What we used for the control was the earthquake early warning shake alert user display. And then we had 4 treatment conditions because there was some disagreement among the seismologists and emergency managers about whether or not we should use very strong shaking or we should use the number 8 for the intensity. And so we did some measurement across the 4 treatment types.
Earthquake, very strong shaking expected in 3 seconds.
So that excerpt comes right out of the shake alert as the control message. We just took that 10-second snippet of a intensity 8 level right out of the program, the computer program. And here's the phone app.
Earthquake, drop, cover, hold on.
And that's just a simulated phone app, obviously. It's not actually one. Here's what we found out with affective and cognitive learning outcomes. When we asked when the shaking will begin, actually 77 to 85% answered correctly across all the conditions. So that's good news, even the shake alert one. How important is it to know? Very important across all conditions. What kind of shaking is going to happen? When very strong shaking, people got that correct across conditions. But remember, we had this numeracy issue with the numbers. When our participants got the version that used the number 8, they could recall it was 8 across the treatment conditions at 66 to 80%. And they could comprehend across the treatment conditions about 60%. So they don't really know what 8 means. But look at what happened with the control condition, which was the shake alert. 0% could even recall 8, let alone what it means. How important is a map? They want that map. Where is it going to occur? It was in Southern California. Only 43% got it correct. Then we drilled down to see if maybe we just looked at the participants that live in Southern California. 64 to 74% got it correct across the 4 treatments, but only 29% got it with the control shake alert. So they want a map, but it has to be a simple map. It can't be complicated. Again, that's that intelligible translation. This is the thing I really get excited about. The behavioral intentions on a 5-point scale where 5 is very likely to look at the app, very likely to drop, take cover, hold on, download the app, yay. And just to make sure that they weren't just filling in the 5s, take no action, 1.29. So that's very exciting. Right now we're currently doing some work with the LA United School District with Eagle Rock and Marlton High Schools to do another message tested and a training actually intervention when they have to, all they have is the PA system to work with. So now what we're going to do is just give you over the last several decades of work some of the key conclusions that we've discovered in terms of each of the areas of the model. First is internalization.
We find that when we have messages that do include the internalization, again, we're talking about compassion, personal relevance, timeliness, and proximity, that we can indeed increase attention and retention. Secondly, with internalization, it doesn't have to be geographically bound. In other words, this is something that individuals can empathize about or can understand the importance.
People want to do something. For example, when the Pulse happened in Orlando, Florida, many people from across the United States and even some of our colleagues and friends from other countries were emailing us to see what they could do and to make sure that we were okay and is there something that they can do to help. And so even though it was geographically bound to Orlando, Florida, people were being motivated to know about it and to help across the globe.
And to those in other countries and in other areas, the Pulse shooting was a mass shooting where 49 people were killed by a single gunman.
In terms of distribution, we've discovered that using multiple social media platforms to distribute the messages will reach multiple audiences quickly and efficiently. So we can't just rely on one platform, whether it's traditional or social media. We need to do multiple so that they can seek that convergence. And consistent messages distributed via multiple channels increase both credibility, source credibility, and believability of the message being told.
When it comes to explanation, got again a number of studies that have gone on over multiple contexts, but when we do have explanations from multiple sources, if they're credible sources, they increase the believability and credibility. So again, this mirrors well with the distribution as well as the content that we share. And then also this explanation communicated simply and even tersely with very, very little information, as Deanna talked about on earthquake early warning, does increase efficacy or that confidence in one's ability to perform the behaviors that will protect them and the ones they love.
And in terms of action, messages that offer specific actionable instructions result in significantly higher knowledge, confidence, and efficacy scores than those without them.
But here's the bad news. If you don't include actionable statements that people can comprehend, you can actually reduce their confidence and heighten their fear. In other words, you've emphasized a problem without providing a workable solution.
And we've also got some conclusions from exemplification that tends to cut across the areas of the model. Negative exemplars influence internalization because they heighten fear. They influence an explanation because there's misunderstanding about what the risk or crisis situation is. And they influence action, that people will they'll freeze. They'll have no behavior or they'll enact the wrong behaviors with negative exemplars. And positive exemplars can influence internalization because they increase attention and they reduce anxiety because it's a cognitive shortcut that says it's okay. Explanation, people are able to retain that information. Smokey the Bear, only you could prevent forest fires. And action, appropriate behaviors, muscle memory, that idea of a positive drop, cover, hold on, positive exemplar.
So where are we going now? We continue to do research. We understand that there are needs that we need to study. For example, being prepared to distribute alerts and warnings via multiple channels. People use multiple channels. We know that if they get that same message via multiple channels, it enhances their believability and gives credibility to the message. We can advocate for ongoing educational training. We believe that terse messages enact, as Deanna said, muscle memory that comes from any kind of training campaigns. And that's why in the United States, and I know in other countries as well, we're very excited about the progress that's made with Shakeout. That's exactly the kind of campaign that we think empowers terse messages.
Mm-hmm.
Be first, be right, be credible is the information, that's the mantra of the CDC. And we always want to be at first and take an influential role in the story when people are talking about a crisis or talking about what actions to take. But even if we get behind, even if a myth or something is being distributed on social media and we're concerned that people will be victimized by that myth, there is hope. We can take on those kinds of messages through our own, using the same channel, but generating competing messages. And we believe that that's very valuable.
Mm-hmm. We also have some challenges that we need to work to overcome. One is cultural norms of understanding and misunderstanding. When we work with different cultural groups across the globe or within the co-cultural groups of the United States, we have to work within the norms of that group to be intelligibly translating and being credible sources. We also have the challenge of apathy among what we term disaster subcultures. People that say that I've lived through an earthquake so many times, I'm not worried about it. I've lived through a hurricane, I'm going to hunker down, I'm going to be fine. That sort of apathy piece. And also the need that sometimes there's different self-protective actions that have to happen during the same event. And earthquakes are a great example. Depending on where you are and where the epicenter is, or where you're located, if you're in a building, if you're driving down the road, if you're by a river, things are different. What the actions are that you should be taking or not taking, and we have to work with that.
Sure, if you're in a centuries-old building, you might take a different response to an earthquake than you would if you are in a building that's been retrofitted for strong shaking.
And of course, there's that challenge of communicating probability and understanding forecasting as opposed to prediction. Those things are always going to be issues that we need to work with to get a way to get broad general audiences to understand those nuanced differences. So in a nutshell, that's what we've been working on. That's the idea model. We believe that it's a simple way to remember what to put into a message, those three components, and then to remember to distribute the messages in multiple channels, multiple mediums to be most effective in getting your message across.
And with that, we're open for questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was really informative. I think what was really great for me was that I felt like you guys answered questions that I had already, because I was specifically thinking also about the forest fires that are going on right now in Tennessee. And so when I was thinking about internalization, when you said it's not geographically bound, that totally connected with me. I have no connection to Tennessee, but just was thinking of the people there. So I think that was really cool. Dale Cox has a question. How do we understand convergence in light of the quote-unquote echo chamber, where people seem to look for multiple sources, but those sources tend to tell them what they want to hear?
Well, that's a very good point. If you believe that if you limit your sources and you want to hear what you want to hear, and as you're absolutely right, you've developed for yourself an echo chamber, that's a problem. And we have to admit that that's a problem. What do we do about that? Well, that's an excellent point, and something we ought to add to the challenges that we face, because we're hoping that people will seek multiple sources of information in issues that don't reside in religion or politics, but we can't be assured that that's the case.
Right, and there's no such thing as if you want to use the Lone Ranger, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. We're not going to get 100% ever, but we're going to get significant numbers that we're going to help people protect themselves and their loved ones. And there are some people that are going to choose to believe their echo chamber and just find what they want to hear, and that group is going to be very difficult to reach. That's the outsiders.
That's a very good question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks for that answer. And Leslie Gordon asks, do you have any positive examples of how to communicate probability?
You had one with the horse racing, didn't you? When out at the Renner workshop, you talked about how people play the odds on the horses. No? Okay.
Positive examples on, well, it's probability is the bane of the risk communicator's existence. Because even smart people have a hard time with probability. By smart people, I mean people who perform well on measures, on standardized tests, and those kinds of things. But I think that what we're starting to get to with some of the work that we've done with Paul Slovic and others in risk communication and probability is when we get to those comparisons that are very straightforward and close to their existence. I think one of those that Paul Slovic talks about, is to try to take something very familiar with individuals and then extrapolate that to the case at hand. So I guess as far as specific examples, I think that we've done a pretty good job in communicating some of the work with airline safety, in that we're starting to communicate to people why it's okay to take some individuals who are at very low risk and put them in an expedited line that has less research or that's less severe screening. What is that? It's the TSA pre-check. A lot of time and effort went into that communication before the move was made to develop that second line that's available to individuals. So we've heard very little pushback from the public on that decision. So that would be an example that I would share that's pretty positive.
And I would also,
TSA pre-check.
I think that's a great example. And I think that that even with that earthquake early warning app program, when we saw that when we used words for very strong shaking or very likely or extremely likely, as opposed to putting numbers to it, because there's a second catch, and that's the numeracy issue, that people have trouble translating the numbers, the numeracy of probability, into linguistic language. So if we can use actual words, extremely likely, might prove helpful.
That's a really good point, because we're not, we don't fully understand whether it's the numeracy, the probability, or an interaction of the two. We don't. We just know that it's. What we do know is that it's very difficult.
Yes.
Another good question, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Leslie says thank you too. She just wrote in and said that. Ken Hudnut, hey Ken, what's up? How do you recommend we should handle the desire by scientists to explain errors and uncertainty versus the need to just boil down messages for broad understanding by, say, the public?
And that is also an excellent question, because we have worked with different types of scientists, not just seismologists or earth scientists, but food scientists, and a scientific brain wants to do those things. And so we hope that the more we can do, we've been doing some work with what we call communities of practice. In other words, trying to bring together journalists, media professionals, risk communication professionals, the scientists of the different field, and even government officials, to get everybody in the same room at the same time to talk and to understand and to come up with a shared language that does make sense across different types of publics. And so I would say that's what we've been trying to do to help with that. And the more we can get some empirical evidence to demonstrate it, scientists understand empirical evidence, and if you can show that, look at the difference here, then I think we're making progress in that direction.
And that's exactly right. That's what I would have said too. The more empirical evidence we have, the better. I just want to say we spent, Deanna and I spent the better part of a Saturday with a group of toxologists explaining how they had to round this cycle of the idea model. And then we said, okay, now's the chance. We gave them a case and scenario, and we said, generate a message. And 7 out of 10 of them left out action and had so much explanation that there was very little internalization too. So we believe that if we can show examples and those numbers, just like Deanna said, that we've got a fighting chance of convincing scientists that it's okay to be terse.
That's a great answer, and that's what Ken wrote in, so thank you so much. Ivan Rincon asks, how do you approach cultural differences or sensitivities when considering messages? Something that may work well with one group may not work well for another one.
What we've done with the work that we've done with different cultural groups is we really try to get together with the opinion leaders from that particular cultural group and understand the cultural norms and nuances of that group. We just did a study with some colleagues over in Sweden, and we really had to work with them and the people in Sweden to understand. It was going to be a food safety project, or it was, and so to understand what channels do the Swedish people typically go to when there's a risk or crisis situation. What kinds of foods do people typically eat that it would resonate with them that this is important for internalization, that this is something that they might eat. Those kinds of things, we have to work directly with the cultural group we're talking to make sure that we're nuancing the message in a way that doesn't offend anybody in that cultural group, but also resonates for that internalization.
That's good. But we have worked with other countries and tried to do it. The general categories hold true, but for example, when we did work in Hong Kong, the way that people internalize messages is very different, very geographically specific. So when we're talking about black rain or other kinds of oceanic activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's definitely about getting with the people from the group and working for ecological validity to make sure things are making sense for that group. But as Tim said, I want to reiterate this. The components of the idea model have been playing out for us regardless of where we've been, what cultural groups we've been used. We've done stuff with underrepresented populations here in the United States, and we've done in different countries. And that idea model, that very simple model, plays itself out significantly in all of those domains.
Except coal miners.
What do you mean by that, Tim?
I mean that they're willing to take a risk.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay.
Mine is they embrace the risk. It's a part of their lifestyle,
okay.
and that's I'm working on that.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating.
When we did some work with Native American populations in North Dakota, it became extremely important to get the opinion leaders from those populations to be sharing the same message that we were sharing because people would believe them. Similarly with pastors in inner city Detroit.
Mm-hmm. Chicago too.
In Chicago, as the opinion leaders, it can't just be us. They sometimes don't trust the officials of the government.
Yeah. You know, there's no sense in trying to employ an idea model if people aren't going to listen at all because their reasons from the past for them not to listen to that source, and that source might be us as government.
That's interesting. I have another question. Monica Gowan asks, can you please discuss any differences you observed in people's message uptake when using a phone alert versus a PA announcement? So for example, are people more likely to see kind of what everyone else is doing first with like an auditory PA message versus a more quote unquote personal message on your own phone?
We haven't done anything to study those comparisons at this point. And the LA school district data, I haven't gotten my hands on it yet. They did the pre-test data and they did the training intervention, and this week they're doing the post-test data collection. So I'm really excited to see what happens with that because one of those schools and it's middle school kids and high school kids, and it's one of the schools is a sort of a traditional LA school, and the other one is actually for hearing impaired students. And so I'm really excited to see what we discover. But unfortunately, we got to stay tuned for that one.
Yeah. Forthcoming.
Great. So I think that's all of the relevant questions for today. And I'm really actually interested, Deanna, you mentioned something about working with Native Americans in North Dakota. And that's especially fascinating because we've been kind of funded to work with Native Americans in Oklahoma. So I'm going to follow up with the two of you about that. But anyway, it's about time anyway, too. So I just want to thank the both of you so very much for doing this for us, as part of our IRIS webinar kind of history and our background. Uh, Tim and Deanna have worked a lot with Lucy Jones in the past, who retired from the USGS in March. And Lucy also did a webinar about kind of from her earthquake science perspective a couple of years ago. And so that's also in our webinar logs of so that you can check into. So now you kind of have the communications perspective and the seismology perspective, which I think is really great. I also, Tim and Deanna host an amazing conference. It's happening in March of 2017 called the International Crisis and Risk Communications Conference. It's held in sunny Orlando, Florida. And I will most definitely be there. Abstracts are due December 5th. I will definitely be submitting one. And as a seismologist, if you want to sit in a room with like PR professionals, communications professionals, people who study nonprofit branding, all sorts of different things, social media messaging, it's a conference that you really can't miss. It was a wonderful opportunity last year to be able to kind of get out of my comfort zone and meet a lot of different people in that respect. So. And yeah, just wanted to advertise for that. But Tim and Deanna, thank you so much. It's been amazing to have you today.
And we've been happy to present. And as you're saying, if anybody interested in our conference, just let us know, and we'll help you get.
Yeah, send us an email, and we can get you connected to the website. And all it takes is a title and an abstract of what you would talk about to submit by the 5th. That'd be great. Again, it's a community of practice. The more diverse kinds of people we can have there discussing this stuff, the better.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. And that concludes our webinar. And everyone have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye.